Welcome to Great Power Politics. I'm Hartmut Lenz. What I would like to talk about today is really kind of putting this idea of power into a concept, a theoretical concept, and kind of combining theory with the expectation what we will find in the future about the distribution of power in an international system. So we will kind of use this idea of power and kind of first go back, look historically at how has it been explained from a theoretical concept, and I'm looking specifically at realist theory here, kind of seeing how realist theory will use power and what kind of factors in realist theory kind of define how powerful a country is. Then at the second point, I will kind of look at this kind of definitional part and see like how it is changing over time. And what I hope you will get from this is a kind of a thought-provoking idea about where we will go in the future. Will power distribution on the international level stay constant, meaning that the United States will kind of continue in this way as being a hegemonic, most powerful country? Will it change? If it changes, how will it change? Where will new powers emerge? And then at the so I want you to think about this very much, and within the bigger framework of this kind of class, we will kind of take these theoretical ideas of the beginning of the class and then go really through it case by case and look at the different regions in the world and see how we can expect their power position to take change within the next 10, maybe 15 years. So thanks, guys. Have a look at the slides, and I look and let me know at the end if you have any questions. Thank you. Okay, everybody. Well, let's jump right into the slides. What we want to talk about today, and I think the overall feature of this class can see like how we can theoretically develop the ideas of power within the framework of international relations and international relations theory more generally. So what I want to focus here in the first part is really to focus on realist theory. You might ask, why realist theory? Well, first of all, power holds a central position within realist theory and is therefore kind of well suited to kind of show how power interaction is really taking place within the international system and between states, but also because realist theory has been for the last century at least, or let's say like after the end of the Second World War, has been a really important theoretical concepts which we can use in order to understand international politics. And it has been lots of new theories and also very important, like liberal theories, have been developed, constructivist theories have been developed as a opposite or like or contrasting themselves on realist theory. So it's really important to understand the theory in order to understand power, but it's also important to understand realist theory in order to understand other theoretical concepts. Okay, let's go. Most of you know already from our introduction course to international relations what realist theory is, but I want to go over the basics first, and I want to see like why are this kind of feature of power so important within this theory. So realist theory has held a central position in international relations theory basically after the end of the Second World War. It became quite famous after that, and it's kind of its key principle is the idea that there is dominance, that kind of countries strive to dominate other countries within an international system, that we have competition. And this kind of competition is based on the idea of power. So states try to exercise power. Um, Often this is also called real politics or just power politics, but they try to exercise this power in a way to survive themselves, but also to push other countries in order to do what they think are the most important steps in international politics, or what their kind of preferences are defining. So we have to see realist theory as something which explains that countries try within this international system try to kind of force each other to kind of confine to the same ideas they have themselves. Why did we come to this idea of realism? Well, basically it developed after the end of the Second World War. In the 1950s, it became very prominent. And to understand why it became so prominent, we can actually have a look first back before realist theory came in the picture, so to say. And then we can see that the academic literature was predominantly focusing on ideas which are now called idealism. So basically, these ideas look not necessarily how the world is acting in the international stage, but kind of trying to find the best possible uh, outcomes, the best possible solutions for international problems, and kind of emphasizing issues like international law, morality, international organizations. Power has at times played a role, but key in international influences were the ideas that we can actually build something which is working for everybody. So the idea here was that human nature is generally good, that countries might get into conflict, but that this is because institutions are not well built, or we haven't found the right institutions to mediate conflict between us. And between World War I and World War II, we can see that this has been actually kind of spilled into the practical politics. We can see that the League of Nations was built very much on these ideas of idealism, to kind of create an institution which helps us to mediate conflict between nations and find a forum which we can use in order to kind of find solutions on a global stage. However, something which also happened in the interwar period and subsequently also led to the Second World War was that we found countries like Germany, Italy, and to some extent also Japan did not necessarily obey by this kind of rules, but kind of follow their own strategy of power politics, which led to something which is much more, which was much more aggressive, and was this kind of institution created on this mutual cooperation didn't have any tools to stop these kind of countries, especially in Germany. We should notice in this way, which kind of was later on often seen as a big mistake to follow an appeasement politics policy towards Germany, and therefore enabling this large conflict of the Second World War, which might have been different if the alliance and the United Kingdom, the US, etc., would have been more forceful in pushing their own interests forward. So what we see after the end of the Second World War is actually that this kind of discrepancy between the academic literature, which looked more on cooperation, and the real world, which was much more conflictual, was seen as negative from scholars, especially in the US, but also in the UK and in some other parts of the world. And they said, like, we should not look at an ideal stream. We should look at have a realistic picture of human behavior, and they blamed idealists to look way too much on how the world ought to be rather than how the world really is. So in their series, they wanted to rectify this and say like, okay, we want to have a clear look at how the world really is and what kind of implications it has for international politics. So some of the key aspects of this was that realists really put at the heart of their theoretical concepts the idea of power, saying that countries are striving for power. They want to become more powerful. And they also use this power to leverage their own ideas and to increase their interests within the international society. So in a way, this is very different than the idealistic perspective before. And they explicitly try to say like other aspects like morality, ideology, or other social and economic aspects of life don't matter as much in international relations than this aspect of power. Power is the driving force of everything, and the others are in times might become more important, but not if really kind of there is a loss or a gain of power possible. The other aspect which is really important is that states pursue their own interests in the international system. So that means that nation states have own interests and that they are not caring for other countries, but predominantly kind of use their own goals and try to pursue them within the international system. We said a couple of times now international system, and I'm sure most of you are aware what it is. If you're not, the international system, it can generally be seen as the combination of all the countries and their interaction. So let's imagine I use this rather silly example quite frequently, but imagine that the world is like a billiard, a pool table. So each country in a way it could be one of the balls. And by interacting, the white ball is kind of pushing through this. There's an interaction between all these kind of different balls. And that is kind of the international system. So an international system is the relationship between all the countries on the world to each other. Not every kind of decision is affecting every country, but it's seen as a whole system where all the member states are participating. The other aspect which is really important in a realist theory is the idea that there is a sovereign state without a central authority which is above the state. It's often called the anarchy of states. So we do have these kind of states within the international system, which are maybe democratic, maybe authoritarian, maybe monarchies, depending on what kind of state they are. But they are kind of having authority to act on behalf of the citizens of this country, right? But there is no higher authority which kind of puts one state above another state. So there's no organization which can kind of, which is on a higher level than the individual states. Having said that, the kind of mediating factor between these states is again the idea of power. So there are more powerful and less powerful countries, and the position, your power position within this international system is really kind of defining what, how much you have to say and how much your interests are represented in the world. So realist perspective really kind of focuses on this idea that there is an international system, every country is member of it, but only these countries are really relevant. And the way they interact with is a power distribution between different countries. So basically some countries are more powerful than others, so automatically they have to be able to say more about it. It's not about this kind of ideas about morality, ideology, and other aspects of socioeconomic life, but rather really about the idea of power. So now you wonder maybe who are the kind of the key scholars in international theory, and very often, especially in realist theory, and especially very often we say like Morgenthau and Waltz are two key key scholars which recently worked on this idea, or not recently, but which worked on this idea of a realist theory. But the concepts themselves are not developed after the end of the Second World War, but rather actually kind of are developed earlier. Like Sun Tzu, Euclides, and Hobbes are all kind of focusing on same ideas, that there is a state-centric idea where power is defining what kind of issues are taking place. They're much earlier. They wouldn't have called it realist theory, but the basic ideas behind them are already existent in these kind of theories. Okay, I want to use this slide to give you an overview to kind of contrast realism with idealism. So this is out of a world politics book, and I think it's kind of a good graph because it shows that where the main differences are. So you can use this at a later stage to actually kind of look at it as well. So we do have realism and idealism on the top here. And here we have the issues where they're actually kind of having completely different opinions about. First, about which is maybe important, is human nature. So realists generally think that individuals are selfish. With individuals, we could also think about individual states. They are kind of pursuing their, as I said before, self-interest. They're trying to advance their own power position within the world in order to develop advantages over other countries. Idealists think quite different about the human nature, and they thought much more about being altruistic, maybe being cooperative in this way as well. So they are generally good. Sometimes conflict occurs, and that's maybe because of mismanagement or misinformation, etc., but generally altruistic. That is one of the key points. This altruistic idea about human nature was criticized by realists, saying like, no, our experience with Nazi Germany, with Mussolini's Italy, etc., didn't show us that countries are altruistic, but rather that they are selfish. The most important actors are also kind of different. So in realism, it's only states. States are really important, and no other organizations are really important. Idealism, and actually at the later stage also liberalism, they argue different. They say like, yes, states are really important in international politics, but other individuals are also important, maybe specific actors or organizations or pressure groups, etc. All are kind of having an impact on it. Economic groups have an impact on it. And so idealists have a much more inclusive kind of picture about who the actors are, while realists are very narrow and say very state-centric, saying states matter, not much more is really important. If you kind of think about the idea of state behavior, why do kind of states behave in the way they do? Realists really thought about this rationalist pursuit of self-interest. So they have an opportunity, and they pursue this opportunity in order to kind of get a better position. And they use their power kind of consciously in order to kind of create this situation. Idealist was thinking very, very different. It was kind of saying that there are psychological motivations of decision makers. Maybe they're scared of an opponent, or they feel compassionate about another actor, etc. And these kind of psychological movements really kind of lead to behavior, to action. While realists kind of reject this idea of psychological motivations, but rather look at rational pursuit of self-interest, and say this kind of self-interest is defining why and how nation states act. Also, the international system has been seen quite differently. As I discussed before, anarchy is a key idea of realism, saying that basically there's no hierarchy above the state. So each state has to kind of make sure that they are safe and try to become as powerful as possible. Why? Well, if they become more powerful, then at the same time they can actually continue in this position, or actually be even like their interests might even be represented better if they become more powerful. So power is a goal in itself. Idealists thought quite differently and thought like, well, no, it's more about community. We are actually a community. And this kind of aspect of together collaboration was very important by idealists because they thought the key kind of idea is to build institutions, build an environment where countries, individuals can cooperate naturally together and become create a level of solidarity with each other rather than having this kind of conflicting situation. So we do see that there are quite some difference between realist idea and idealist idea. And this kind of contrast became really dominant. And realist theory is often seen as too negative in a way, just kind of looking at the quote unquote bad sides of human behavior rather than kind of looking at the more positive sides, which we can discuss or we will discuss in several classes at a later stage also. But it is really kind of powerful in understanding why power, the idea of power, is so dominant in international relations. What I want you to do now is to actually push the pause button on this video and kind of write down on a piece of paper, how useful do you think this concept of realism is today? Are we really in this world where egoistic countries, egoistic quote unquote, of course, countries try to pursue own interests, self-interest, or are we in a situation where collaboration is becoming much more common and we are actually not looking necessarily anymore for this pure rare power politics? Okay, please now stop the video and write down a couple of points what you think. In our Zoom class, we will talk about this in more detail and can help if you have written something down. Thanks. Okay, well, welcome back. I hope you wrote down a couple of points, and I want to kind of continue this this lecture by talking about another scholar, namely John Ikenberry. I have mentioned his book, The Liberal Leviathan, already in our last class, and I really want to kind of continue with his ideas because his liberal ideas are in a little bit in contrast with the realist theory, but are not completely different. Yeah. So what he was really analyzing in his book is the idea that hegemonic power is the key to seeing international relations. And what he says is that basically countries, if they are very powerful, like the British Empire, they can establish rules for the international society, which then can be followed by others. So he was contrasting, especially the British Empire, with the United States after the end of the Second World War, and was seeing that there are different kind of mechanisms at play. While the British Empire tried to become as powerful as possible and kind of sucking out any kind of advantages which it could get, the United States did it a little bit different and kind of created something which was like a participatory hegemonic system. So basically, it created institutions where other actors, saying European countries, later on Japan, also the United States, and China, and to some aspect even in the Soviet Union, in case of the United Nations, could actually kind of participate and therefore share this idea of the international order, kind of share the concepts of the international order and share the benefits of it. However, the interesting thing is that other countries in this way, because they're participating, are willingness of applying to the established rules of action. Yeah. But there is a twist to it, and this is that the United States is still a hegemon. It kind of created these rules and did not necessarily kind of create them completely independent, like equal, that everybody is equal, but skewing them a little bit in their own direction in order to kind of have a bit favorable situations. Why is that important? Because Ikenberry argues with this kind of participatory hegemonic rule, the United States can be very powerful in the international system beyond its own narrow power base, because the international rules actually favor the United States over any other actor. So it is that the United States is more powerful than anybody else and needed to be more powerful than anybody else in order to establish this rule. But at the same time, the United States is also favored by the international rules, the international system, the organization it kind of created, and therefore kind of developed its, over time became even more and more powerful. We will go into this idea much more in detail in the next class, but I want you to kind of get used to this idea that power is not necessarily something which is stable and is not completely independent of institutions, etc. So Ikenberry argues that these international organizations are very helpful for kind of having this the hegemonic position of the kind of stabilizing the hegemonic position of the United States, because they are able to overcome fluctuation of US power and maybe actually kind of create rules which outlast the hegemonic position of the United States altogether. In the next class, we will discuss this in much more detail, but just keep the thought in mind for the moment. Okay. But in a way, we were talking about international theory. We were talking about it, even the liberal Leviathan now, but still, we didn't really define well power. And that is something which we talked about in our last class already, which is really problematic, that power is a central concept in international relations theory. It's a central concept for realists, but it is very difficult to measure and even difficult to define. So let's take the rest of the class maybe in kind of thinking about power, how we can measure it, what we can think about it, etc. Well, first of all, in a very kind of simple idea, the definition of power, as we have in last class already, is, yeah, we can see the ability to get other actors to do what it would not otherwise have done. So if you can kind of convince somebody else to do what you like, you're powerful. Why? Because you change the action of the other actor into an action which is preferred by you. So in a way, we could say like, okay, we can, if actors are usually getting their way, they must be powerful, because only then they are. Why would other people? Why would other countries follow them if they are not powerful? So in a way, power is not something which is going into you, but rather something your ability to influence others. So really, the idea here is that it's not about what you have, but rather like how others react onto you. But in order to measure this, we have to kind of look at the specific features of a country, because if we just say you are influencing others, then we are very easily kind of in a tautology, which we discussed in our last class already, that power is something which we can't really observe externally of that it is used. So we had in our last class already that we looked at this kind of tangible and intangible ideas or characteristics of power of a state. Do you remember that? So basically, in terms of tangible ideas, we could say like, these are things which we can count independent of the power position of the country. For example, something like military power or economic power, etc. These are kind of, we can observe externally and we can use it in order to understand the position of a country. Intangible, at the other hand, is much more difficult to observe. We do often call them soft power, and therefore mean something like around the lines that it becomes the ability to convince actors. For example, having very good diplomatic network, or being very credible. Like Sweden, for example, not really kind of involved in lots of conflict, is often seen as quite powerful in terms of soft power. Why? Because most actors actually like listen to it and hear what they are saying, rather than kind of seeing them as an adversary. Yeah, so intangible points are really important, and tangible as well. So in terms of tangible points, we can say like size, economic capacity, and armed forces can summarize very quickly the biggest factors of power from a tangible perspective. Yeah, the problem here is really that we should not fall into a circular logic where we actually measure power just by its outcome and assume that this kind of power is there, rather than kind of creating an independent measure. So if we have to take like one key kind of aspect of power, often people say that the gross domestic product, GDP, is a good measure of power. You might wonder, like, why is the size of the economy really so important? Does your economy really kind of influence other countries? Well, in a way, yes. It directly, of course, can be an influence in order to kind of, you could put economic pressure on other countries. Other countries might actually, if you kind of depend on your market if you're very successful, so selling things to you or buying products from you. But there is another aspect of it. It's also that it enables you to do other things. So, for example, if you have a very developed economy, you might also be able to develop a much more capable military power. Also, very often, this is a good indicator for technological levels. So, wealth and technological level, it kind of helps you again to build an advanced military force, and therefore being able to kind of actively use your power in this. So GDP is often seen as a long-term kind of indicator, which helps us to see how powerful countries are, but also maybe how powerful they could be, or much more. GDP is more how powerful they could be rather than how much they are. We also have to say that this is a very rough indicator. It's not something which we can use and say like, okay, we can fine grain it, and every kind of inch of GDP is kind of leading to so much more power within the world. It's rather a very kind of fine grained system. We will talk about the kind of biggest power at the later stage in this lecture. But for example, GDP of Russia is not among the most powerful countries. But many people would say like, well, they are still one of the most powerful countries in the world. Why? Because it's large nuclear capacity. So GDP is often used as an indicator, but far from perfect. As I said, power is also depending on this intangible kind of aspects, which we should not neglect. Often also called like national willpower, for example, diplomatic skills, popular support of the government, how legitimate a government is, and its international reputation, whether it's seen as a country which can be trusted, or whether there has been kind of conflicts in the recent past which make it much harder for a country to be trusted. Let's say Germany after the Second World War had a much more difficult stance than Germany has nowadays, where it has a better track record, and therefore is seen as more trusted than it was in the 1950s, so to say. However, even though I'm focusing in this class very much on the aspect of power, we should not kind of say that power is the only kind of decisive factor. That would be wrong and would be too crude. It is one among many factors, but it's definitely one of an important aspect of international politics. One concept which I want to kind of introduce at the end is the idea of relative power. So we can see that power is not necessarily something which is absolute, but much more relational in comparison to others. So we see that power relationship between two countries are depending. The one is more powerful and the other is less powerful. But it's not necessarily the absolute kind of distance between those two, which is really important, but rather like where they are sitting within this hierarchy. That leads to kind of ideas of relative power, which are sometimes a bit counterintuitive. So we could, for example, argue economic cooperation between two countries might be a good idea, right? Because it makes countries wealthier. Also, therefore, they may become more powerful. But if you think about it in absolute terms, they become more powerful. But if you think about it in relative terms, that might not be the case. So if one country benefits a lot and the other country benefits much less, then actually what happens is that the one is becoming gaining much more from this cooperation than the other. And in relative terms, it becomes more powerful in relation to the other. So realist theory especially says about this, we need to think power as relative, always in relation to other countries, not as absolute. So therefore, countries might actually not be willing to cooperate with other countries, not because it's not beneficial for them, but because it's more beneficial for the other side. And therefore, they are not kind of agreeing to it. Whether this is true and whether this is a good concept, we will discuss in a later part of this class. Liberalist theories think much less about relative power and much more about absolute power. And they would say like, no, as soon as it's preferential for a country, it would do it. But realists would say like relative power is important. So depending on how much the others gains is really important in this aspect. Well, I want to kind of give you just some food for thought on this slide and say like, in a way, estimating power is generally something which doesn't really kind of reflect well in defining conflicts. So, for example, the idea, of course, in realist theory is that the more powerful state will prevail in a conflict, that it's actually kind of pushing its will through more than the less powerful. But that's not always the case, because maybe it's also the cost in relation to what the benefit are an important factor here as well. Let's say, to visualize this a little bit, I give you the example of the United States and Afghanistan. So Afghanistan and the United States have been in a conflict over the war on terrorism for the last more than 10 years. And in this conflict, basically the United States is by far outreaching its power position towards the power position of Afghanistan. This is in economic, in military, in any kind of level where you could think of, the United States is probably more powerful than Afghanistan, and far more powerful. However, if we kind of look at the outcome of the conflict, and it's not over yet, but it seems like they're kind of getting closer to each other, it seems that actually the United States did not achieve a lot within their conflict in Afghanistan. Why is that the case? Well, because also maybe it is not as important for this conflict is not as important for the US than it has been for Afghanistan. And it's very difficult to actually find good solutions in the ideas of the US has for Afghanistan. So in a way, yes, the US is more powerful, but it doesn't mean that it's always the winner in a conflict. You can see this in many kind of conflict, that the United States does not necessarily prevail in the way we would expect from the power imbalance between the US and the other actor. This should be called not man, but many ingredients. Sorry about this. I have to change this at one point. So state power is a mix of many ingredients. Yeah. So you could say like this kind of tangible things like natural resources, industrial capacity are really important. But also other things. Moral legitimacy, for example, is often seen as a soft power. So is your cause just? Is it seen by other countries as just? Or is it seen as unjust? Military preparedness is also a really important factor, like how much capability is there in terms of preparedness rather than something along the lines of how many tanks, etc. a country has. The popular support of a government is also kind of important in a way. What we do see very often is an effect which is called rally around the flag. So as soon as a country is threatened from the outside, it becomes more united on the domestic level. But support of a government is really important in order to kind of see how it can act on the international stage. We'll talk about this also more at a later stage, but generally speaking, it's something which is very difficult to measure, and it has an impact on the power position, but not necessarily kind of so easy to kind of put into the mix here. However, these are much maybe more short-term kind of aspect. The long-term aspects are, and they're kind of similar, as I said before. The idea is about total GDP. So this is the economic performance of the country. Population. You might ask, why is population important? Well, it's not so much that all of this population could be used in the military, but also it is again a reflection of the potential of GDP. A very big population, especially a young population, etc., might actually have a big impact on the prospect of the GDP in the future. Territory. Territory is also important in terms of like military conflict. For example, one reason why Afghanistan is doing so well in any kind of conflict with any superpower, whether it's the United States or the Soviet Union beforehand, or even the British during the empire, is that its territory is very mountainous, very, very difficult, and therefore it's very difficult to have a conflict within this country, because nobody except the Afghans can actually kind of work this territory as well as they do. Geography is very well related to this, but a bit different. So very often, like countries which are close to the sea, for example, have different features than countries which are very kind of landlocked or different parts of the world. So depending on where the positions is also kind of having an impact how powerful these countries are. Okay, in this kind of slide, I want to show you something which I think is important in understanding, and that is the continuation of economic performance and kind of changing the power position. So we say like economic performance is really important, but this is not something which is a constant. It's not something which we have every time, all the time the same. This slide is not, it's from the 1950s to 2010. So it's not very current, and you might actually be surprised that here China is overtaking the United States. What this is not the GDP or the percentage of GDP in absolute terms, but it is the percentage of GDP in a GDP debt ratio. So that means kind of looking at the performance in terms of GDP, looking at the debt what a country has. And in this way, what we can see is that since the 1950s, there's a continuous decline within of the United States. Also, interestingly, is that well, we have a rise of Japan, but then a decline again. Germany had a very initial rise, but then also a long-term decline. France as well. United Kingdom actually even steeper. The Russian Federation or premier Soviet Union had this kind of big gap, and then is on a much lower level. At the other hand, we have here this blue line is India, and the dark blue line is China, which shows that in this ratio, actually, they become much more important in the last decade, and actually decades since let's say since the 1990s more generally, but since 2000, kind of especially in terms of China, very kind of importantly going up. So what we do see here is that there is a shift within the world as well. And this is something if we assume that GDP ratio is changing, why would we kind of assume that there is a constant situation in terms of power positions within the world? So we do have a continuation, we do have a change over time in the key factors which define power in terms of GDP and others. So we must expect that there's also kind of fluctuation within the power position of each country. Well, in a way, if we kind of interpret this card, I did already here, you can read through the details on this slide as well. It is just kind of explaining it again. But we do see that China and India generally have an upward trend, while at the same time, there is a downward trend in some of the old powers. But we see the Western European countries, Germany, United Kingdom, France, etc., since the 1960s, but also on a much higher level from the United States. Japan had a rise and a fall as well in this after the 1990s. So we do see a shift in power positions, and this kind of shift might actually kind of have an impact on what areas and what countries are really kind of important on the global stage as well. So I want you to kind of think about this a little bit and say, like, do we talk here about individual countries? Do we kind of talk about power shift maybe from, let's say, the United States towards countries like China, or with an extent, maybe also India? Or are we actually kind of looking at a power shift of regions? Do we look at maybe the Western Hemisphere, the traditional kind of power structure with the United States and Western and Europe is kind of declining, while at the same time the Asian countries, India and China are increasing, and maybe the region as large is also increasing its position. So please think about this, how you would see it specifically in your way, this kind of new power distribution. So one thing I think you should take away from this is that economic powers actually changes. And therefore, this kind of shift in global GDP and shift in distribution of global GDP can lead to long-term trends which are maybe going away from this kind of traditional power positions towards power positions in new regions, or maybe in specific countries. And I think this will be a theme which we are looking throughout this class, is that do we have these kind of shifts? Are they long-term? Are they short-term? Are they reversible? How are these kind of projections within the future going? So I want to take this kind of ideas into your, keep in your mind, and think a little bit about the whole class within this. Do we, within this kind of concepts, do changes in economic power lead to a change of the power structure overall, and therefore maybe lead to a change of the international system and the political system as well? So that's it for me. for today. I hope you had fun with this class, and I look forward to see you in the Zoom class. Please write on our Padlet site any kind of questions you have, and please also write what we had here, this question about how useful do you think these kind of realist concepts these concepts of realist theory are today. Okay, I look forward seeing you on Tuesday. Take care, and yeah, all the best.
This morning I woke, restless and heady, with blood pulsing fierce in the vein. There's light on a line.